You think the problem is time, that you started too late, chose the wrong path, missed the window everyone else seemed to walk through at 25. That is not the reason your life looks the way it does today. The reason is quieter, and it has nothing to do with your age. You have read the books, you have listened to the lectures, some of them more than once. You can quote the sentence about assuming the feeling of the wish fulfilled, almost word for word, and your life, for the most part, still looks the way it looked 5 years ago. That gap between knowing the teaching and living from it is not a personal failure. It is a structural detail Neville addressed directly, and most people skip past it on their way to something more inspirational. Neville Goddard spent decades teaching one idea, stated plainly enough that most people walked past it, looking for something more complicated. Your subconscious does not build your life from what you want. It builds from what you have assumed as already true and felt as real. Not the sentence you say out loud, the state you occupy in private when no one is listening, including you. He called it living in the end, not hoping for the end, not working toward the end, living from it as a felt fact before a single circumstance has agreed to it. Assumptions, even false ones, harden into fact when they are persisted in without interruption. This is not a suggestion. It is a description of a law that has been running your life since before you had language for it. Neville pointed at one detail people talk past constantly because it sounds too small to matter. The two words, I am, not as grammar, as command. Whatever you attach after those two words is not a comment on your condition. It is an instruction given directly to the part of you that builds your circumstances. I am too old for this. I am stuck. I am the one who always gets overlooked. Said once, these are complaints. Said for 10 years, in the tone of private fact, they are architecture. The subconscious does not evaluate whether the sentence is fair, accurate, or deserved. It accepts, I am, the way a builder accepts a signed order, without negotiation, without asking whether you meant it. This is why the same two words, redirected, are the fastest liver available to you at any age, starting from any current condition. Not, I am going to be. That phrase still lives in the future, still confirms lack today. I am, stated now, about the state already assumed. The words are ordinary. The mechanism behind them is not. Here is where you may recognize yourself. You are somewhere between 35 and 55, enough years behind you to have a story, enough years ahead of you to still call it unfinished, and a quiet, persistent sense that the story has already been written by someone else. You check a retirement balance and do the math you promised yourself you would not do again this year. You sit across from a spouse you built an entire life with, and the conversation has the temperature of two roommates confirming a schedule. You watch someone 10 years younger get the title you have been circling for a decade, and you tell yourself it is politics, timing, luck. You attend a reunion or scroll past one and measure your life against a story someone else is curating. You think about the version of yourself at 25 who had a plan, and you do not recognize the person currently living out the result of that plan. You lie awake doing arithmetic about how many working years are left, how many healthy years are left, how many years the children will still want you in the room. A health scare, your own or a friend's, quietly resets what you thought you had time for, and then the urgency fades within a month, and the old schedule reclaims you. You watch a marriage near yours end in divorce, and instead of asking what that reveals about your own, you file it as someone else's story. You call a parent who sounds smaller on the phone than they used to, and you notice, for one uncomfortable second, that you are now the version of the family that is supposed to have this figured out. You compare your marriage to the one your parents had at this age, and cannot tell if it is better or simply quieter. You notice you have started saying, at my age, about things you would not have said at 30, and you say it as if it were a fact instead of a sentence you chose. None of this is coincidence. Each of these rooms was built by an assumption you accepted once, quietly, and never revised. Not one bad year, not one bad decision, one unrevised sentence, repeated on a loop long enough to become furniture. Here is the part that is easy to miss. None of these situations required your permission to start, but every one of them requires your continued agreement to keep running. That agreement is renewed nightly in the last few minutes before sleep, whether or not you have ever noticed the renewal happening. Most people assume that season of life, the drift between 35 and 55, is simply what happens. The body changes. The marriage settles. The career finds its ceiling. Neville's entire body of work exists to contradict that sentence directly. He was not writing for 20-year-olds with no history to revise. He was writing, repeatedly, in language aimed at people with exactly the kind of accumulated evidence you are currently holding. People who had every reasonable justification to conclude the story was mostly finished. Neville described the visible world in one recurring image, a mirror, not a metaphor meant to comfort you, a mechanical description. A mirror does not negotiate with the person standing in front of it. It does not improve the reflection out of sympathy. It does not punish the reflection out of spite. It returns exactly whatever is presented to it. Most people spend years trying to adjust the mirror. Better circumstances, a different job, a new city, a different partner, hoping the reflection changes as a result. Sometimes it does, briefly, because the surrounding scenery changed, but the face in the mirror is unchanged, and within a season, the same expression reappears, in a new setting, wearing a different name. The only lever that ever actually works is the one standing in front of the glass, not the glass itself. This is not a discouraging fact. It is the most practical fact in this entire teaching, because it means the work was never located out there, waiting on circumstances you cannot fully control. It was always available, tonight, in the one place you have complete access to. So here is the actual method, not the poetic version of it. Neville described a state he called akin to sleep, not full sleep, not ordinary waking attention, the narrow, drowsy state just before sleep takes you, where the body is still and the critical, arguing mind has finally gone quiet. In that state, you do not repeat a sentence. You do not recite an affirmation like a student under exam pressure. You construct one small scene, a scene that implies the wish is already fulfilled, a handshake that would only happen if the deal had already closed, a voice on the phone that would only sound that way if the relationship had already healed, the ease in your own steps that would only be there if the health had already returned. Short, specific, felt, not narrated. You replay that single scene, in that drowsy state, until it carries the tone of memory rather than the tone of wanting. Then you let it go, and let sleep take it from there. If you value understanding the structure behind your own mind, subscribe. These conversations are not isolated. They build. This is not visualization as decoration. This is deliberate, engineered memory, planted at the 1 hour of the day. Your defenses are finally down enough to accept it. Most people skip this because it takes discipline at the exact hour they are most tired. That is precisely why it works, and precisely why so few people ever practice it consistently enough to see it work. There is a second piece most teachers leave out. The scene has to be brief, not a movie with a plot. One small sensory detail, the weight of a hand on your shoulder, the specific words of a congratulations, the exact sound of a door closing on a home that is already yours. One detail, repeated nightly, outperforms an elaborate fantasy revised every few weeks. The subconscious does not need drama. It needs repetition of one convincing detail, delivered at the hour you cannot argue with it. There is a rule attached to this practice that most people violate within the first week. Without realizing it, the state has to be single, not the wish fulfilled, held in one hand, and the worry about how it will happen, held in the other. You cannot assume the promotion has happened while also mentally drafting the argument for why you deserve it more than a colleague. You cannot assume the marriage has healed while also rehearsing the resentment you will bring up the next time there is an opening. Two states, held at once, do not average into a mild version of the good one. They cancel. Neville was direct about this. Concern yourself with the end, not the means. Not because the means do not matter in the world of action. Because the moment you start managing how it has to happen, you have quietly re-entered the state of wanting. which is the state of not yet having, which is the exact state you were trying to leave. The wish fulfilled is occupied as a fact. A fact does not need a plan to become true. It only needs to be lived from. There is a distinction Neville drew that matters more at this stage of life than at any other. Desire and demand are not the same state. Desire says, I do not have this, and I am afraid I am running out of time to get it. Demand says, this is already mine, and I am simply waiting for the visible world to catch up to what is already settled internally. The first is urgent, restless, and checks constantly for proof. The second is calm, because a fact does not need to be checked. At 35 to 55, desire often disguises itself as motivation, the countdown feeling, the sense that this has to work this time, the subtle panic underneath even the most disciplined routine. That urgency, however productive it looks from the outside, is still the state of lack, dressed in effort. The assumption that actually moves the outer world is quieter than that. It does not hurry. It does not check. It already has what it is assuming and behaves accordingly. There is a companion application of the same principle, and almost no one extends it this far. Not what you say to people, what you rehearse saying to them in your own mind when you are alone. The conversation you replay with a spouse defending a decision they have not even questioned yet. The speech you compose in the shower addressed to a boss who is not in the room. The argument you win in your head against a sibling or an ex for the 4th time this month. Notice something about all three. You are not remembering these conversations. You are writing them in advance and then living toward the outcome you just rehearsed. If the imaginary conversation is defensive, you will find real reasons to be defensive by evening. If it is resentful, you will find a real opening for resentment before the day ends. The mind you carry into any room was already built in a room by yourself earlier when no one else was present to interrupt it. This is the same law as the state akin to sleep, applied at a smaller scale all day long, mostly without your awareness. Controlling it does not mean suppressing every difficult thought. It means noticing which inner conversation you are currently financing with your attention and asking whether it is the one you would want to harden into fact. Now, the structure goes one level deeper because a technique alone does not explain why so many people practice it for 2 weeks and quietly stop. Your current situation is not simply a set of circumstances. It is a rehearsed identity, performed so long it stopped feeling like a performance. Neville drew a distinction between 2 uses of imagination, and most people, without knowing the term, have only ever practiced one of them. Wandering imagination is passive. It is the daydream, the idle worry, the rehearsal of an old grievance, the mental replay of a worst-case scenario. It happens to you. Awakened imagination is deliberate. It is chosen, entered on purpose, directed toward a specific end, and held with the same seriousness you would give an important phone call. Most people, for most of their adult life, have been fluent only in the first kind. They can spend 45 minutes rehearsing a worry in vivid cinematic detail without ever noticing they were imagining at all. They call it thinking, the exact same faculty aimed instead at the state akin to sleep, and one clear scene is the entire mechanism this teaching depends on. You are not being asked to acquire a new ability. You already have it. You have been running it for years, unsupervised, mostly in the service of what you did not want. The only shift required is direction. Neville often returned to one story to explain this, the parable of the prodigal son, and he read it as psychology, not as history. A son leaves his father's house with his full inheritance. In this reading, the father's house is your awareness of who you actually are, whole, provided for, without lack. The inheritance is your imagination, the one creative power you were given without condition. The son goes into a far country and spends everything on what the story calls riotous living, not literal excess. The far country is any state of consciousness, built from appearances, instead of from the awareness of your true identity. The riotous living is imagination, spent carelessly, worry rehearsed in vivid detail, grievance replayed until it is fluent, fear given more craft and more attention than any goal you claim to want. Eventually, the story says, a famine comes, and the son finds himself feeding pigs longing to eat what they eat. The famine is not punishment. It is simply the natural harvest of a mind that has been feeding on lack for so long, it forgot there was ever another diet available. And then one line changes everything in the story. He came to himself. Not a new circumstance arrived. Not a rescuer intervened. A single moment of recognition. This is not who you actually are, and this is not the house you actually belong to. He decides to return. And in the story, the father does not wait for the son to walk all the way home as proof. The father runs to meet him while he is still far off. That detail matters more than any other line in the parable. The response was not delayed based on how long he had wandered. It was immediate, based only on the fact that he turned. This is the part almost no one applies to their own life. You are not being asked to earn your way back through years of evidence. You are being asked to come to yourself once, clearly, and turn, which leads to the second concrete method, the one Neville called the pruning shears of revision. Whatsoever a man sows, that he also reaps, not eventually in some vague spiritual sense. Specifically, the state you dwell in today plants the seed for the circumstance you will meet tomorrow. If today produced a scene you did not want, a conversation that went badly, a moment you handled poorly, a piece of news that landed hard, that scene is a seed, still capable of being changed before it fully takes root. At night, before sleep, you take that scene back, not by pretending it did not happen, by replaying it internally, exactly as you wish it had gone. The conversation that went badly, replayed as it should have gone, calm, respected, resolved. The moment you handled poorly, replayed with the version of you that handled it well. The piece of news revised into the outcome you would have chosen. You are not rewriting history for comfort. You are changing the seed before it becomes tomorrow's harvest. This single practice, done nightly, without exception, is one of the most understated tools in his entire body of work, because it looks too simple to be doing anything. It is not simple. It is precise, and it requires you to stop rehearsing the day as a victim of it. Neville called the guarantee behind both practices the law and the promise. The law is mechanical. It does not evaluate whether you deserve the outcome, whether you started late, or whether the timing seems reasonable. It simply returns whatever assumption is persisted in. The promise is that persistence is the only requirement, not talent, not luck, not youth. He compared it, more than once, to a seed placed in the ground. A seed does not grow faster because it is dug up daily to check on its progress. It grows in the dark on its own schedule, and the only real threat to it is the hand that keeps interrupting it out of impatience. Most people, at this stage of life, have already learned patience with other people's timelines, a mortgage, a career ladder, a child's development. The same patience, applied to an inner assumption instead of an external checklist, is the entire discipline being asked of you here. Not blind hope, not passive waiting, a held state, undisturbed, given the same respect you already give, a seed you cannot see. Notice what revision actually replaces. Most people, at 35 to 55, have a nightly habit already in place, replaying the argument and winning it retroactively in their head, replaying the meeting and imagining the version where they said the sharp thing, replaying the decision from years ago and prosecuting themselves for it, again, on schedule. That is revision's evil twin. Same mechanism, same nightly repetition, opposite direction. You're already revising every night. The only open question is which direction it runs. Here is what this actually costs you, stated without softening it. It costs you the satisfaction of being right about what happened to you, the industry that overlooked you, the marriage that changed, the parents who did not prepare you, the economy, the timing, the people who got there first. Every one of those stories may contain real facts, but every night you spend rehearsing them instead of revising them is a night you plant the same seed again. It costs you certainty. You will assume a state with no external proof for a period of time that feels longer than it should. The bank account will not agree yet. The relationship will not have caught up yet. Some mornings, it will feel like performing a private, unwitnessed lie. That discomfort is not a sign you are doing it wrong. It is the exact friction of an old, well-rehearsed identity losing the only vote it ever had, your continued agreement. It costs you an old audience. Sometimes, people who knew you inside the old story may not recognize or welcome the new one. Some will ask what changed, in a tone that is not quite a compliment. There's a subtler cost, too, the comfort of comparison. Measuring your progress against a sibling, a college roommate, a former colleague, has quietly functioned as a way of grading yourself without ever setting your own standard. Once the assumption changes, the comparison loses its usefulness because you are no longer building your identity from where you rank. You are building it from the state you have decided to occupy, regardless of where anyone else currently stands. That is a harder habit to release than it sounds, at an age where decades of comparison have become almost automatic. Something else loses its purpose along the way. The convenience of the people around you who have quietly benefited from your unchanged assumption. The colleague who looks more capable standing next to your resignation. The relative who feels less alone in their own stagnation while you share it. The version of the marriage that requires nothing new from the other person, as long as you keep requiring nothing new from yourself. None of them arranged this consciously, but an unchanging assumption in you is, for some people around you, a convenience they will not name and will not thank you for disturbing. And underneath all of it sits a particular identity many people your age have quietly adopted without ever choosing it, the identity of the one who sacrificed, who did the responsible thing, who gave up the risk so the family could have the stability. That identity is not false. But if it has become the entire story, revising it can feel like betraying the years already spent inside it. It has not been wasted. It has been building the discipline the next chapter actually requires. Nothing done in that identity needs to be reversed to move past it. None of this is dramatic. It is simply the actual price, and it is worth stating plainly instead of pretending the shift is free.
Here is the version of your life if none of this is ever applied. Not collapse. Nothing that dramatic ever announces itself. Just repetition. Another year at the job you have been quietly resenting, since a specific Tuesday you could probably still name.
Another year where the marriage runs on schedule instead of presence, and you both agree, without ever saying it, not to look at that too closely. Another birthday where you tell the same story about why this was supposed to be the transition year, and then it is not. The children get older watching a version of you that is competent, present, and quietly waiting for something to change on its own. There is a phrase, used long before Neville, that he returned to often in his lectures: the years the locust hath eaten, years that were not destroyed by a single event, years that were simply consumed slowly by a mind on the wrong assumption, one ordinary evening at a time. Most people do not lose a decade in a single bad decision. They lose it in 10,000 small, unrevised evenings, each one too minor on its own to notice. Picture the version of this that never turns. 60 years old, telling the same story about the opportunity that went to someone else at 41, the story now polished smooth from repetition. A marriage still technically intact, run for 2 more decades on logistics instead of presence, until presence is no longer even missed, only vaguely remembered. A body that finally demands attention. It was quietly refused for 30 years. At the exact age there is the least energy left to negotiate with it. A retirement arriving with more free hours than settled peace, because the free time was always assumed to be the fix, and the assumption underneath the discontent was never actually addressed. None of this requires a crisis to arrive. It only requires the same assumption, unexamined, given 1 more decade to keep doing what it has always done. Here is the part of the teaching almost never included when this material gets repeated online. Neville's answer to lost time was not resignation. He taught, directly from that same passage, that what looks like wasted years can be restored, not undone, not pretended away, restored meaning the assumption you hold today is powerful enough to reorganize what those years produce going forward, starting immediately, regardless of how long the old pattern ran. The locust does not get a vote on how long the restoration takes. Only your current assumption does. This is the actual, load-bearing promise underneath everything discussed here. It is not too late, not because time is forgiving, but because time was never the operative variable. The assumption was. It still is. Consider what this means practically at your stage of life. With the years, you can actually count on both hands. It means the decade that felt wasted is not a verdict. It means the marriage that has gone quiet is not a life sentence if the nightly assumption about it actually changes in private before either of you says a word to the other. It means the career plateau is not proof of a ceiling. It is proof of a repeated assumption held so long it started to look like a fact about the world instead of a fact about your imagination. None of this requires the other person to change first. None of it requires the company, the market, or the years already spent to reverse themselves. It requires one thing repeated nightly, with more discipline than you have been giving your grievances. Consider, too, what this changes for the people watching you, whether or not you have ever addressed it directly. Children absorb an assumption long before they absorb an explanation, not the speech about hard work, not the advice offered at graduations and holidays. The assumption you actually live from, observed daily, at close range, for years. A parent who quietly assumes stagnation teaches stagnation, regardless of what is said out loud at dinner. A parent who assumes, calmly and without announcement, that change is still available at any age, teaches that instead, without a single lecture required. This is not a reason to perform change for an audience. It is simply an accurate description of what is already being transmitted either way. Apply it, specifically, to the three places this usually lives. The career, not, I am hoping for a better position, I am, followed by the title, the respect, the compensation, held as current fact, felt nightly through one small scene. A specific colleague's congratulations, a specific number on a specific screen, the marriage, not managing the other person's behavior, waiting for them to initiate warmth first, assuming, privately, the marriage already restored to closeness and revising, nightly, any scene from the day that confirmed distance instead. The body, not bargaining with a diagnosis or a number on a scale as though willpower alone moves it, assuming vitality as a current state, held quietly while still doing what a physician and common sense require. The inner assumption and the outer action are not substitutes for each other, they are companions. In each case, the outer world is not the target, it is the report. You do not argue with a report. You do not negotiate with a report. You change what is being reported on, and the report updates on its own schedule. Here, specifically, is what tonight looks like, stripped of anything abstract. Before sleep, take the one scene from today you would not want repeated, the tense exchange, the moment of doubt, the evidence that confirmed the old story again. Revise it. Replay it as it should have gone, in enough sensory detail that it feels lived, not narrated. Then construct one small scene implying the state you are choosing to assume, the handshake, the voice, the glance, and hold only that, undivided, until sleep takes it. No plan attached, no explanation owed to anyone, including yourself. Just the state, held once, correctly, tonight. Repeated, night after night. This is not a metaphor for change. It is the mechanism of it. So the only honest question left is not whether this works. It is when you begin applying it as though your remaining years actually matter, instead of treating this as content to agree with and quietly set aside by tomorrow afternoon. Not when the marriage improves on its own, because it will not, from the same assumption that produced its current temperature. Not when the job situation resolves itself, because a resolved external situation was never going to precede the internal one. Not once the children are older, or the mortgage is lower, or the timing finally feels right, because timing was never the variable, and it will not become one now. Not next year, when things settle, because next year will be assembled, seed by seed, revision by revision, or lack of it, from what you do with tonight. Not once you finally forgive the person you have been rehearsing an argument with for years, because the forgiveness was never the precondition. The revision is how it actually arrives, not when you feel young enough again to justify starting over, because that feeling too is downstream of the assumption, not upstream of it. If you're going to change your reality before this year ends, comment this: I am my new version, not as a hope you are posting into the internet to feel better for a moment, as the assumption you are choosing to occupy tonight in the drowsy minutes before sleep, when the argument finally goes quiet enough to let something new in. Most people spend their remaining years waiting for proof before they will allow themselves to feel it. Few ever discover that the proof was always downstream of the feeling, and that the years still ahead are not owed to the story already written, but to the one you finally decide to assume.